Hello, this is Jamie Mitchell, and we are back for another episode of the Libertarian Uncensored podcast, going over all the posts on the Libertarian Uncensored subreddit. Let's get right into it. So first we have Representative Ronnie Jackson is calling for trans people to be mass institutionalized, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the 5051 subreddit, and that looks like a screenshot of some article from Newsmax. They have an underlying level of aggressiveness, he said, of transgender women, adding that left-wing media come in every single day telling them that they are victims. He went on to argue that transgender Americans face legitimate psychiatric issues related to the stuff that they've been exposed to, and that society needs to respond with stronger mental health interventions. We have to treat these people, we have to get them off the streets, and we have to get them off the internet, and we can't let them communicate with each other. I'm all about free speech, but this is a virus. This is a cancer that's spreading across this country, Jackson said. Yeah, and my thoughts on that are, personally, I do think a lot of transgender people do have mental health issues. Not all transgender people, but definitely a lot of them. But the libertarian position is, if people shouldn't be forced to be institutionalized for mental health issues if they don't want to. If they're not hurting anyone else, if they're only hurting themselves, that's on them. I think if transgender people do want to be institutionalized voluntarily, that would be fine. But the libertarian position is, no involuntary institutionalization. And I think it might be. You could argue it's well intentioned. I definitely do think a lot of transgender people do have some mental health issues going on. But regardless, it's just because it's well intentioned and wants to help people doesn't mean it's good. Just because authoritarianism is good and you agree with it doesn't make it justified. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have the Trump administration says IUDs and the pills are abortions from jessica.substack.com, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's a cross post from the Law subreddit. And personally, I would say neither of those should count as abortions, but ultimately the government's in the position to define words however it feels like. It's the same thing when it comes to things like marriage or milk or etc. etc. Ultimately that's why we shouldn't want the government to be that strong and powerful and authoritarian, because they can define words however they feel like. It's a lot like how when Biden was in office but they collaborated with the dictionary companies to redefine the word recession, because historically recession was two back-to-back quarters of negative economic growth, and which what did happen under Biden, but they didn't label it a recession because they changed the definition of the word. And that's very much how you can't let the state control definitions, regardless of regardless of which branch of the Uniparty is in charge currently. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next we have FCC chair threatens Jimmy Kimmel over Charlie Kirk monologue from HollywoodReporter.com. And personally, I don't really care for Jimmy Kimmel. I don't really care for any of ABC. So it's just another DNC propaganda channel. But regardless, the libertarian position is, it needs to fail on its own merits. You can't have the government threatening them. And that's my thoughts on that issue. We'll talk about this one more later. Next we have, I'm most likely wrong, it just seems like Reason, the magazine website, is going above and beyond to cover Charlie Kirk, posted by Wonderful Regret 252, and they said, if I'm wrong, let me know. It just seems Reason, several writers, is really coming out in defense of Charlie Kirk. I love their civil libertarian stuff, stories about the Institute of Justice's work, stories about cops, any story about government intervention, their market stuff, not so much, their anti-rapid transit stuff, not so much, their segues into conservatism and culture wars, not at all. Reason is great when it's not being preachy about shit. And personally, I think Reason, it's a very libertarian periodical. Some people might consider it to be more normie libertarian, and I've heard it described as like the CNN of libertarianism is kind of more on the normie side. But with that being said, they do have a lot of good work, and it just goes to show you that Reddit's never going to be happy if anything remotely libertarian at this point. If you make any write an article or say something that Reddit disagrees with, they'll literally call you Hitler, fascist, Nazi, all the nicknames they have in their book. And eventually, you just grow numb to it. This guy, if he doesn't want to like Reason, that's fine. But, it just goes to show you that even normie libertarianism is too much for Redditors at this point. It's sad because Reddit used to be quite the libertarian website back around 2012-ish. But now it's just another DNC progressive woke Marxist propaganda shithole, just like a lot of other social media and traditional media. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have Trump administration asks judge to rule against Vermont's climate superfund law, and that's a post from CH4Locks, and that's a cross post from the Vermont subreddit. And yeah, personally, I think, the states should be able to make whatever climate superfund laws they want to, and the federal government shouldn't have any say in that. But with that being said, just because a lower level of government, like a state or local government, makes a law doesn't mean it's not authoritarian. Personally, I don't really care for, I do think the climate's changing to some extent, but I definitely think the government is just using it as an excuse to push authoritarian laws. And, I don't doubt that the Vermont law might be well intentioned, but, I don't think the government should be making any laws regarding the climate. And yeah, I guess it's good that the federal government took out the law, you could say, but I personally don't think that's very good either, because it sets the federal government as the all powerful when it comes to making and enforcing laws, rather than the state governments. But as I said earlier, just because the state government says something, makes a law, or a local government makes a law, doesn't mean it's not authoritarian. Even if it's just the government of a household, doesn't make it not authoritarian either. And all laws are authoritarian regardless. Just all laws are authoritarian to some extent, regardless of the level of government that they're done at. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have ABC suspends Jimmy Kimmel's late night show indefinitely over his remarks about Charlie Kirk's death, from ABCNews.com. And yeah, I have a few comments on that. I would say one of my comments is, that the narrative ABC seems to be going with is, oh, the FCC is forcing our hands are tied. Well, in reality, they've been trying to get it out of Kimmel's money sink contract for years, and now they have an excuse to do so. And also, I'd like to add, that it seems like the Reddit progressives care more about Colbert and Kimmel getting taken off the air than Charlie Kirk getting murdered in cold blood. I had a post on that on the Autism Politics subreddit called Reddit Values. I said, Charlie Kirk gets murdered in cold blood, and average reader seems to think it's completely justified. Colbert and Kimmel get taken off the air, and average reader seems to think it's the worst thing ever. It's a great lesson why you should never take this website seriously. The vast majority of its user base has no values other than in-group good, out-group bad. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have conservatives are using Charlie Kirk's death to enact sweeping speech crackdown, from truthout.org, posted by Donald Key. And yeah, personally, I don't really care for that, but the woke have been using cancel culture for pretty much since the Justine Sacco incident in 2013, where she was tweeting, "Oh, I'm going to Africa, hope I don't get AIDS," and then they canceled her and had her fired from her job. That was one of the first big instances of modern social media cancel culture. And they've been doing that for pretty much a decade so far, but suddenly it's used against them, and it's the worst thing ever. And that just goes to show you, no values, no principles, only teams. When their side does it, completely justified. Oh, it's not cancel culture, it's just consequence culture. But when the other side does it, it's suddenly the worst thing ever. And yeah, it's interesting how I replied to this one Redditor, Ninja Lover, who said, "Oh, fuck the FCC." First, the FCC threatened their license if they didn't fire him in regards to Jimmy Kimmel. I said in response, "That's kind of stunning, but losing any late night TV at this point really isn't a great loss." And I linked to an article from things Colbert did last year, Skibbity Biden, which was very cringe, and that's very much why, increasingly late night TV is nothing but a Reddit circle jerk. But then I added an edit. Also, love how the guy who has had me censored from his quote-unquote uncensored subreddit for over a year suddenly cares about freedom of speech and not deplatforming people. He might say, oh, it's just because the government's involved. But, just because the government's involved doesn't mean, anything really. The government's just one class of people, all censorship is authoritarian, and Reddit's admins and mods, they might not be controlled by the government. I guess, there probably is some government interference at this point, I would say, especially with regards to how much the DNC is influencing Reddit behind the scenes. But regardless, this guy is justified censoring me and deplatforming me from his subreddit from his quote-unquote uncensored subreddit for over a year, and suddenly, he thinks censorship and deplatforming people is the worst thing ever. It's sad. People like him get more and more Reddited every year, where they only come after one side while completely ignoring their the authoritarianism themselves and their own side. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have the FCC threatening ABC with the removal of their FCC license if they don't cancel Jimmy Kimmel's show for his skit about Charlie Kirk is approximately status censorship, and apparently being libertarian, quote unquote, being libertarian doesn't know that. And that was a post from Historical Donut 6758, and that was them sharing a tweet from Being Libertarian, well, bye, and that was them quote tweeting another tweet they did. Breaking: Jimmy Kimmel Live will be preempted indefinitely after suggesting Charlie Kirk's alleged shooter was a MAGA supporter, ABC spokesperson. And then he shared some other images. Federal Communications Commission Chair Brendan Carr suggests ABC's broadband license was at risk for criminal statements about Tyler Robinson, the accused killer of Kirk. And yeah, personally, Jimmy Kimmel, he was pretty much just average Redditor, but on TV, so of course Reddit's going to be sad that he's gone. I definitely don't think the FCC should have threatened him, but, it's definitely the narrative ABC wants to go with. The narrative ABC wants to go with is our hands are tied, the FCC's coming after us, when in reality, it was a convenient excuse for them to dump Kimmel, and an excuse for Reddit to pick up narratives that, Trump's a Nazi, which they've been doing pretty much on repeat for the past 10 years, If Trump was I said this I think in the last episode, but if Trump was as fascist as Reddit says he is, Reddit would have been banned a long time ago, pretty justifiably at this point I might add, since it's nothing but pretty much progressive Al-Qaeda.com at this point. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have, I guess it depends on the politics they agree with, posted by Help with Eating, and that's a cross post from the Black People's Twitter subreddit, and that looks like a tweet from Robert Patillo. Remember when they said they don't want to mix politics and football? And on the left, it's it seems like the Dallas Cowboys Jumbotron says Charlie Kirk in 1993, 2025, and on the right, it's a picture of Colin Kaepernick taking a knee. And yeah, I guess I would agree with this, that, people are very unprincipled these days, both on the left and on the right, as I like to go over a lot in this podcast, just because, they didn't get, one side doesn't care for Kaepernick and the other side doesn't care for Kirk, doesn't make it too much that much difference. The two sides of the same shit coin. They just want to put their side in the culture war rather than have any neutral take on the issue, and that's my thoughts on that issue. Then we have breaking: Trump designated Antifa as a major terrorist organization, posted by Ragnar OKXG, and that's crosspost from the Something Is Wrong 2024 subreddit, and that looks like a screenshot of a tweet from Donald Trump. I am pleased to inform many USA Patriots that has designated Antifa, a sick, dangerous, radical left disaster, as a major terrorist organization. I will also be strongly recommending that those funding Antifa be thoroughly investigated in accordance with the highest legal standards and practices. Thank you for your attention to this matter. And yeah, my thoughts on that are, ultimately, terrorism is another word that, much like abortions, marriage, milk, etc., is ultimately going to be defined by the government. And personally, the government can just label any force that doesn't originate from themselves as terrorism, which is why I'm personally not a big fan of the label. With that being said, I'm sure if this was Joe Biden tweeting, I'm designated Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Free Percenters, any other of the right wing groups as terrorist organizations, Reddit would be all over it. Which just goes to show you, as I say, in pretty much every one of these headlines, own no values, only teams. Next we have Trump says he's designated far-left anti-fascism group Antifa as terrorist organization from CNN.com, posted by Swamp Hanky Dan. That's crosspost from the Law subreddit. And yeah, as I said earlier, it just because it's if Trump wants to near Antifa terrorist organization, wants the government to act as such, ultimately the government has the legal monopoly use of force to do whatever they want to. But it's interesting because, as I said previously, if this were Proud Boys, Oath Keepers, Free Percenters, any Patriot Front, any right-wing group, Reddit would think it's the greatest thing ever. And it just goes to show you, they have no values, only teams, just like I said to the previous one. Next we have Trump tariffs could fund bailout for U.S. farmers. Agricultural Secretary tells FT. Finance from FinanceIO.com, posted by XGH737. And yeah, personally, I don't think the government should be bailing out anyone. People need to survive on their own, rather than rely on the government for support. I do think, definitely big business, I didn't like how the government bailed out businesses saying they were too big to fail back in 2008, I would agree very much with the Bernie take on that, if business is too big to fail, it's too big to exist, just let them fail on their own merits, rather than, bail them out. And I would say the same for farmers. I guess you could make the argument maybe for some small farmers they should be bailed out, but, definitely not the factory farmers, which a lot of them are at this point, that a lot of farmers aren't like the classic old, 19th century, on their ranch kind of farmers. A lot of farmers these days are big factory farmers, and I definitely don't think those would be the ones that they should bail out, but those are the ones that would probably be bailed out rather than the small, independent farmers that they might market this as a bailout for. And that's my thoughts on that issue. Next, we have compassionate and sympathetic. He was also not because people with those traits would not be proposed that we ban third world immigration entirely. People with such traits would not say that Haitian immigrants would be masters of residence in Alabama. Posted by Historical Donut 6758, and that's a screenshot of a tweet from Being Libertarian. He tweeted okay then, and they shared a meme. Charlie Kirk said he can't stand the word empathy, therefore he was a terrible person. And then the other guy has a file. He says, "Why don't you read the entire quote?" When he goes on to say he prefers the word sympathy. And then the guy labeled leftist says, "I don't want the entire quote. I just want to hate Charlie Kirk." And then they added some other pictures. Charlie Kirk tweeted on June 9th of this year, "It's time to ban third world immigration, legal or illegal. We've reached our limit. We have a huge cultural, educational, housing, financial, and essential services problem fixed now because of it. We need a net zero immigration moratorium with a ban on all world borders." Then he also tweeted recently, "You need to watch this and then commit to stopping all forward immigration to America." That was him quote tweeting the new Minneapolis mayoral candidate, who's I think from Somalia, Omar Fattah. And that tweet was Omar Fattah, mayor of Minneapolis, planning to raise the minimum wage, freeze rent in Trump City. And then also there's a video from Indisputable with Dr. Ra, and then it cuts off, but it says, "Watch, Charlie Kirk says Haitians become your masters in racist meltdown." And then the OP ad just saying, "Some people are going out of their way to defend this asshat, and I don't understand why." And yeah, personally, if you want to defend or not defend Charlie Kirk, that's on you. He did have some controversial takes, I'll say. But or at least some takes that could be considered controversial by modern standards. Back in like 2000 or 1990 or the 1990s or so, they wanted to be as controversial. But everything's controversial these days, it seems, in regards to politics. But regardless, if you want to think Charlie Kirk was a bad person, that's on you. But that doesn't mean his murder was entirely justified, and that's what Reddit seems to think. Since Charlie Kirk was a bad person by their standards, that his murder was entirely justified. And it just goes to show you that, they don't have any values, only teams. I personally don't care for a lot of shit that someone like Hassan Piker says, but if he got murdered, I don't think that would be justified either. But Reddit, if Hassan Piker got murdered, they think it's the worst thing ever. Well, since the guy from the other team got murdered, suddenly it's, either justified or they're just gonna say, all the reaction to the censorship, cancel culture and all that is an overreaction. It just goes to show you, if they don't have any values, only teams, as they always like to say. Then we have what Charlie Kirk actually said about Biden getting the death penalty from Snopes.com, posted by Ninja Lover. And yeah, this is just another Charlie Kirk bad post. Reddit only seems to care about pushing the narrative that Charlie Kirk's bad. If you want to think Charlie Kirk's bad, that's fine. But he got murdered for just saying words. And if it were up to Reddit at this point, I'd probably be looking a lot like him in a pine box somewhere, buried underground somewhere. But just since it's on, but Reddit, they don't, as I said, it's just out group bad, in group good at this point, and that's pretty much every post. If Charlie Kirk wanted to make an edgy statement about Biden getting the death penalty, that's that's on him. But Reddit, they'll only care because it fits their Charlie Kirk bad narrative. They don't seem to care anything else about him. It's like they're personally trying to take quotes out of context to show how bad Charlie Kirk is, and it just goes to show you, they're only committed to the narrative rather than anything else. And yeah, everyone has their own narrative to some extent, but it's definitely really bad on Reddit currently in regards to in-group good, out-group bad, and that's pretty much every post as I go on over in this podcast. So I think we're going to wrap it up there. I'll see you guys in the next episode. Bye.